Every national park keeps two kinds of stories. The ones written for visitors, tidy, polished, approved, and the ones whispered by rangers after midnight, when the radios go quiet and the trails belong only to the dark. Those stories live in old binders stored on metal shelves, in reports with whole paragraphs blacked out, in logs that skip hours without explanation. Most recruits never see them. Some rangers refuse to talk about them, and a few say the parks changed the day certain incidents were pulled from training, not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important, too strange, too difficult to control, too close to something the wilderness still keeps for itself. These are the reports that didn't make the handbook, the warnings that were quietly removed, the moments when the forest, the desert, the cliffs, and the canyons answered back, and the rangers stopped asking questions, locked the doors, put on your headphones, and pull your blanket tight around you. Because after this video, you'll never see America's national parks the same way again. The North Rim Static Burst. The North Rim is the quietest part of the Grand Canyon, higher, colder, emptier. Rangers say the silence feels different there, heavy, pressed down by the weight of miles of stone. It's the kind of place where radios become lifelines, where a single missed transmission can mean hours of exposure. But in the early 2000s, a series of incidents changed how the North Rim teams worked after dark, and those events were quietly removed from the training materials for new recruits. The first report came from a pair of seasoned rangers performing a standard sweep near Widforce Point. It was close to sunset, the canyon glowing red with the last light. One ranger radioed in, "North Patrol, all clear," but the transmission returned with a strange echo, not static, not distortion, but his own voice repeating a second time, slower, dragged out as if someone else was speaking through it. He tapped the radio, assuming interference. Then the line filled with a sharp burst of static, loud enough that both men ripped off their earpieces. When they tried again, the radio was silent. Not broken, silent, like it was receiving perfectly but refusing to transmit. They hiked out early, rattled, and filed a report. The file was acknowledged internally, then never referenced again. Weeks later, a second incident occurred during a nighttime rescue alert. A hiker was overdue near the Ken Patrick Trail, and a small team assembled to sweep the ridge. As they advanced, one ranger heard something through his radio, a rhythmic clicking, spaced evenly, almost like breathing filtered through static. He asked the others if they heard it. They didn't. Moments later, the entire team's radios lit up with a full band burst, a crackling roar that lasted 3 seconds and stopped the search cold. Say our protocol requires immediate triangulation after interference. They attempted it, but the readings came from multiple directions at once, like the source was moving, or the canyon walls were bouncing the signal in ways no equipment could interpret. The most troubling incident happened the following season. A small group of backpackers had failed to check in from the North Rim backcountry. As a ranger team traced their route, they descended into a shallow basin just before nightfall. That's when the radios began transmitting on their own, short, clipped breaths, followed by a faint voice whispering something unintelligible. Every ranger heard it. Every ranger froze. Then a single phrase cut through the static, "Don't come down." The team stopped immediately. Seconds later, rock shifted somewhere below them, a low, grinding slide, the sort that precedes a collapse. They backed away fast. When they reached stable ground, the cliff beneath the basin gave way, sending several tons of loose stone into the darkness. Had they continued down the trail, they wouldn't have survived. When they tried to replay the warning later, the recorded audio was blank. The backpackers were eventually found safe on a different section of the rim. Their disappearance had nothing to do with the collapse, but the message, that impossible transmission, became a whispered legend among the veteran staff. Some believed it came from a ranger on a nearby channel. Others thought it was a fluke in the canyon's acoustics. But one ranger, a quiet man with 20 years on the job, said something different. "The canyon listens," he told a new recruit once, "and sometimes it answers, but it only answers when it needs to." For years afterward, training materials avoided mentioning radio anomalies. New rangers received the sanitized version. Always carry backups. Always check your channel integrity. Always expect interference. The older rangers taught something else. If you hear static forming words after dark, stop moving, because in places like the North Rim, warnings don't come twice. But when the static cleared, something else was breathing on the line. the Hermit Creek footfall reports. Hermit Creek sits far below the south rim, tucked into a narrow canyon where shadows gather early and disappear late. Rangers know the place well, its switchbacks, its blind corners, its constant echo of running water. It's a long, brutal descent, and at night the trail becomes a corridor of sound. Footsteps carry strangely. Voices warp against the stone. Even veteran rangers refuse to hike it alone after sunset. In the mid-1990s, Hermit Creek became the center of a quiet internal discussion at the park. A pattern of footfall reports filed by multiple teams over several seasons. Footfalls, footsteps, heard on the trail after dark, clear as a person walking but with no visible source. The reports weren't dramatic, they weren't sensational, they were simply consistent, and that made them impossible to ignore. The first came from a pair of rangers finishing a routine water check near the lower camp. They were halfway up the trail when they heard someone following them, heavy steps hitting the ground with the deliberate rhythm of a tired hiker. Both rangers turned. No lights, no movement, no one. They kept walking. The footsteps resumed, closer this time, matching their pace. They stopped again. Silence. When they moved, the steps returned. They logged the event as possible echo anomaly. A month later, another ranger descending to assist a dehydrated hiker reported hearing someone running behind him. Not walking, running. Full stride. He stepped aside instantly, expecting an exhausted backpacker barreling downhill, but no one passed him. The sound stopped directly at his shoulder, as if a person had halted mid-stride. He waited. Nothing moved. When he continued down, the running started again, but this time ahead of him, farther down the trail. He reached the hiker, shaken but unhurt. Then came the incident that forced the park to take the reports seriously. 3 rangers were conducting a midnight sweep during peak heat season, checking for stranded hikers, who often underestimated the climb. As they approached a section of the trail lined with narrow walls, they heard the unmistakable crunch of footsteps descending toward them. Clear, measured, slow. They radioed out, announcing visual contact with an approaching party. No response came from the person, only footsteps. They waited on the switchback, shining their headlamps up the trail. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing off the stone in a pattern too deliberate to be an animal. But no silhouette appeared above them. No light, no shadow. The sound arrived at the curve, reached the bend, and stopped dead only a few feet away. One ranger called out. Silence answered. Then the footsteps started again, but now from behind them, far down the trail they had already cleared. The team froze. Echoes don't jump positions. Sound doesn't leapfrog past you. They hurried back toward camp, uneasy and off balance, the footsteps trailing them for nearly half a mile before fading into the creek's distant roar. After that, more logs surfaced. A ranger at Hermit Rapids heard footsteps circling his tent after midnight. A trail crew reported footsteps pacing the ridge above them during a rockfall assessment. Day search and rescue teams swore they heard footsteps following in formation behind them, matching the spacing of human legs, not wildlife. And in every case, the pattern was the same. Footsteps with intention, footsteps with weight, footsteps without bodies. The official explanation became acoustic distortion in narrow canyons. And yes, Hermit Creek is notorious for strange sound corridors. But rangers familiar with the area pushed back. They said the sounds weren't echoes. Echoes fade, echoes smear. Echoes don't change direction or stop at your heels like a person deciding whether to speak. The logs stopped being written in the early 2000s, not because the sounds stopped, but because supervisors quietly discouraged filing them. Creates confusion, one memo said. No actionable hazard, but veteran rangers continued warning recruits anyway. If you hear footsteps behind you on Hermit Creek after dark, don't call out, don't slow down, and don't stop, because footsteps without a body mean something is moving the sound, not the stone. And even worse, it's pacing you. And if footsteps fall without prints, who and or what is walking? The missing section of the Smoky Mountain logs. The Great Smoky Mountains keep their records the way they keep their fog, layered, overlapping and never quite clear. Every incident, every search, every strange radio call ends up somewhere in a binder or a digital archive. At least, that is what the new rangers are told. What they are not told is that, for a brief window in the mid-1990s, an entire section of those logs went missing. Not misfiled, not damaged, removed. It started during a routine audit in 1996. A supervisor at the park's backcountry office was tasked with reviewing old search and rescue reports, making sure everything was in order as the park transitioned more data to digital storage. Most of it was tedious. Lost hikers found at trailheads, twisted ankles, weather evacuations. Then he opened a binder marked with a handwritten label, Ridgeline Incidents, 1993-1995. Inside, one report stopped him cold. The log described a small team sent to sweep a rarely traveled ridge above a remote drainage, a place so overgrown it didn't appear on standard visitor maps. A hiker had been reported overdue, last seen heading toward an unofficial overlook along that ridge. The team hiked out in the late afternoon, following coordinates scribbled in pencil. They checked in by radio at regular intervals, and then, halfway down the page, the narrative stopped mid-sentence. The next lines had been blacked out with a thick marker. Below that, in smaller handwriting, someone had written, "See continuation, pages 3 to 5, but when the supervisor flipped ahead, pages 3 through 5 were gone. The report jumped to page 6, which simply read, "Subject not located. Search suspended due to conditions." No description of what those conditions were, no debrief, no explanation. He checked the index. The system still listed the pages as existing. Curious, he pulled other binders from the same years. In 3 separate volumes, he found similar gaps. References to see attached addendum with no addendum present. A patrol log that mentioned unusual atmospheric conditions along unnamed ridge with the rest of the description cut off. A radio transcript with an entire block of dialogue replaced by a single line, redacted per supervisory request. Rangers who had been around in the mid-90s remembered the search. They remembered more than the log said. They said the ridge never felt right. Too quiet even for the Smokies. Birdsong stopped as the team approached. The air grew thick and still. One ranger recalled checking his watch near a stunted oak, then checking it again a few minutes later, and realizing almost an hour had passed. The light in the hollow below had shifted from late afternoon to near dusk in what felt like a blink. At some point, their compasses drifted 15 degrees off north. One ranger reported hearing something like wind rushing through trees, but none of the branches moved. Another swore he heard his own voice call his name from farther up the ridge. The same tone, the same cadence, even though he hadn't spoken. When they reached the coordinates where the hiker was supposed to be, they found an odd arrangement of broken branches laid in a rough circle, as if someone had started building a shelter and then abandoned it. No pack, no footprints, no sign of a fall, Einov. Just a ring of snapped limbs and a feeling that they were standing where they shouldn't. The team lead radioed in a status update. According to those who were there, the reply that came back didn't match any known dispatcher's voice. It was calm, monotone, slightly distorted, repeating their call sign and telling them to clear the area immediately. When they tried to confirm the instruction, the line went dead. By the time they regained contact, they were already heading off the ridge. The official record would later say, inclement weather approaching forced them to retreat. But the forecast from that day shows clear skies into the night. The hiker was never found. When the supervisor brought up the missing pages during the audit, he was told not to worry about them. Old paperwork, someone said. We cleaned out the clutter. But the Smokies don't produce neat gaps. Paper gets damp, smeared, smudged, not surgically removed from the middle of bound logs. Years later, a young ranger asked a retired colleague about the ridge. The older man went quiet. Then he said, "There are places here we check less than we say we do. Not because we forgot, because we learned." The official line is that the missing pages were lost in the transition to digital records. But the binders themselves still show the torn remnants where they once were, the faint imprint of words pressed into the next sheet. Those reports didn't vanish by accident. Someone decided that whatever those rangers saw on that ridge, whatever they heard on that radio wasn't for new eyes. But those pages weren't lost. They were removed. The canyon with the one-way echo. Zion is a park built from sound as much as stone. Every canyon has its own voice. The slap of water in the narrows, the wind tunneling between sheer cliffs, the distant thud of rockfall. Echo Canyon, tucked along the route toward Observation Point, is famous for how perfectly it returns sound. Rangers joke that the canyon remembers everything, but in the mid-2000s, a series of incidents convinced veterans that Echo Canyon had started remembering too much and returning something that didn't belong to it. The first report came from a ranger leading a small maintenance crew through a narrow slot where the canyon walls pinched together like the jaws of a vice. The ranger stopped to test an echo, clapping once, expecting a crisp return. Instead, the echo came back wrong, thinner, delayed, almost stretched, as if the canyon were replaying the sound at a slower speed. The team laughed it off as acoustics. Zion is full of strange auditory quirks. But then came the second clap. The return didn't match at all. Not the rhythm, not the tone, not even the number of beats. It came back as two claps, one soft, one sharp, as though something deeper in the stone had answered. The crew filed a note, but nothing official came of it. A few months later, a different team entered the canyon during a routine sweep before monsoon season. They shouted ahead to check for hikers farther up the slot. The echo returned immediately, but from the wrong direction. Instead of bouncing from the wall ahead, it came from behind them, near the canyon mouth they had just passed through. When they shouted again, the echo didn't return at all. It was swallowed by the stone. That report was quietly marked acoustic anomaly. The most troubling event happened during a heat wave in late summer. A veteran ranger, someone with decades in the park, entered Echo Canyon alone to verify a rockfall risk flagged by a visitor earlier that morning. The canyon was empty, no wind, no water running, just dry stone and heat. He tested the echo out of habit, calling a simple "hey" into the corridor. What came back was not his voice. The reply was lower, rougher, and carried a strange trailing quality, almost like a whisper laid beneath the returning sound. Startled, he tested again, using a short whistle. The echo returned as a whistle too, but longer, as though it continued beyond the point where his breath ended. He stood there listening as the canyon repeated his sound with its own cadence, its own length, its own rhythm. He reported feeling watched, not in the supernatural sense, but in the way every hair on his arms lifted at once, as if the air itself had shifted behind him. When he turned, nothing was there, but he said the silence had shape, like someone standing just outside his field of view. He tried his radio. The line was clear. He called out loud again, repeating his whistle. This time, the canyon didn't return a sound. It gave 3 taps, sharp, metallic, spaced with deliberate precision, echoing from somewhere far deeper than the mapped canyon walls. The ranger backed away slowly, listening as the taps repeated once more, then stopped completely. No rockfall was found. The ranger filed his report, and the file was never added to the public logs. In the following seasons, more rangers reported hearing strange replies, echoes that came back too fast or too slow, or from impossible angles. A few described responses that overlapped their original sounds, like the canyon was trying to match their timing and failing. One ranger said the echo repeated his whistle 3 times in a row, even though he'd only whistled once. Acoustic engineers consulted by the park blamed unusual canyon geometry, but none could explain why these effects had never been recorded before, or why they happened only in a section of the canyon that had remained unchanged for centuries. Today, Echo Canyon still behaves normally for most visitors, but rangers sent in for early morning or late evening sweeps sometimes pause before calling out, not because they expect danger, but because the canyon has a habit of sounding occupied before dawn and after dark. One veteran said it best, "Echoes are supposed to give you back what you put in. When they start giving you something else, leave, because in Echo Canyon, not every reply belongs to the person who made the sound, because echoes aren't supposed to return with new information." The blackout at Chalone Peaks. Chalone Peaks sits above Pinnacles National Park, like a pair of broken teeth, jagged, wind-carved, shaped by ancient volcanic activity that split and drifted the land over millions of years. Rangers know the climb well, especially the long stretch of switchbacks that lead toward the fire lookout on North Chalone Peak. Up there, radios usually perform better than anywhere else in the park. Clean line of sight, minimal interference, strong signal, which is why the blackout never made sense. The first incident occurred during a heat wave in the early 2000s. A newly minted ranger was performing a routine ascent to check communication equipment near the summit. Halfway up, he felt a sudden pressure in his ears, like stepping into an airplane cabin mid-flight. The air thickened, wind died, birds went silent. His radio crackled once, then fell dead. He tried every channel. Silence. Not static, silence. He continued climbing, assuming he'd stepped into a temporary dead zone. But the higher he went, the stronger the pressure became. He later described it as walking inside a sealed room where the air didn't want you there. When he reached a narrow saddle beneath the final ascent, he heard something behind him. A single footstep on gravel, clear, weighted, human. He spun. Nothing. He called out anyway, his voice echoing strangely, almost bending around the rock before fading too soon. He took a breath and reached for his radio again. It clicked on by itself. A faint hum filled the line, long, low, almost like electrical current vibrating through distant metal. Then the hum broke into uneven pulses, like something was trying to form a pattern. Before he could speak, the radio emitted a burst of static so loud he dropped it. The static cut instantly, replaced by total silence again. He retrieved the radio, but something else caught his attention. His shadow. It had shifted, not in a natural way, not elongated by the sun or curved by terrain. It had moved several degrees to the left, pointing in a direction that didn't match the light. He blinked hard and looked again. This time it was normal. He convinced himself it was heat distortion, but he rushed the rest of the climb, uneasy, watching the ground more than the trail. Near the summit, the blackout ended as abruptly as it began. His radio beeped, reconnecting to dispatch with perfect clarity. The pressure lifted. Wind returned. Birds called from the ridges. Everything felt normal again. Too normal, as if someone had flipped a switch. He filed his report, but supervisors chalked it up to equipment failure and dehydration. Months later, a trail crew experienced a similar blackout. 3 rangers ascending to inspect storm damage lost radio contact simultaneously. Their GPS units froze. One ranger described hearing a low rhythm under the dirt, a vibration pressing upward through his boots. Another said she felt the air around her chest tighten, as if altitude had doubled instantly. The third reported seeing the horizon flicker, not shimmer but flicker, like a film frame misaligned for a split second. At the exact moment all 3 attempted to radio the same status update, their devices powered down completely. When they regained signal 10 minutes later, their timestamps were out of sync by several minutes, even though no time had noticeably passed. Later that season, the most unsettling incident happened at dusk. A patrol ranger near the base of Chalone Peaks received a distress ping from higher elevation, a location no ranger was scheduled to be. The signal repeated twice, each transmission clearer than the last. The call sign belonged to the new ranger from the first incident, but he was off duty and confirmed to be at home. When dispatch replayed the recording, the audio contained a faint, shaky breathing followed by 3 words, "Coming down now." Every ranger on shift insisted the voice was his. By the time a team reached the coordinates, no one was there, just a patch of disturbed gravel and an area of unusual warmth radiating from the ground. The warmth lasted for hours after sunset. The recording was archived, then quietly moved out of the standard logs. New recruits during following seasons were told nothing about the blackout zone. Only the older rangers warned them, "If you feel the pressure change at Chalone, don't stop moving, and don't trust the radios. Sometimes they broadcast things no one said." Pinnacles is a place shaped by ancient force, shifting plates, volcanic fractures, massive uplift. But none of the official explanations ever addressed the timing, or the silence, or the way voices returned through the static long after the people who spoke them had gone home. Because Chalone Peaks doesn't just kill signal, it bends it. And in those 22 seconds of darkness, something approached. 6 reports, 6 moments pulled out of training manuals, tucked away in old binders, or whispered only when the sun has already slipped behind the ridgeline. Every national park carries its own kind of history, carved into rock, folded into forest, pressed into the silence between radio calls. But these stories remind us that there is another history beneath it all, one that rangers feel but rarely name, one that doesn't fit neatly into paperwork. Maybe that is why these logs went missing, edited or quietly set aside. Not because someone wanted to hide danger, but because someone understood that not everything inside these parks can be fully explained, controlled, or prepared for. Some things are older than the trails, older than the search manuals, older than the hands that first mapped these places. If you made it this far, thank you. Your time, your curiosity, and your voice are what keep this channel alive. If one of these reports stayed with you, leave a like. Tell me in the comments which state, which park or which hidden corner of America you want opened next. Your opinion truly shapes where we go and which stories we dare to unearth. Because some places aren't dangerous, some places aren't haunted, some places simply wait for the right person to listen. And tonight, we listened.